Mother's Day weekend, I read an article that was titled, "Your Mom Lied to You." And it just lists all the unknowing, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, lies that moms tend to pass on to their children, who then pass them on to their children, and so on. As I read the article, I began to make note of the different lies my mom has told me, and especially when I was a child, here was one of the lies. You need to put some hydrogen peroxide on that. How many of you were told this by your mom at one point or another? You had hydrogen peroxide in the medicine cabinet at home, and it turns out that those healing bubbles are actually attacking your body. According to the research I found, latest research says that hydrogen peroxide can cause cellular damage and actually extend the healing process, makes it longer. So, thanks, moms. Really. Happy Mother's Day. Appreciate that. Someday when you're in a nursing home. I'm just kidding. So another lie that my mom liked to tell is this one. Cracking your knuckles will give you arthritis. How many of you were told that by your mother? Something along those lines. Yeah, a lot of us bought into that one, didn't we? So it turns out, according to the latest knuckle cracking research, and there's more than you would expect, cracking your knuckles does not cause arthritis. I read a number of studies. My favorite study was of a doctor from California named Donald Unger, who for 60 years experimented on himself. And he cracked his knuckles on his left hand twice a day for 60 years. So some 438,000 times he cracked the knuckles on his left hand, but on his right hand, he left those knuckles completely uncracked. And at the end of 60 years, he's like, there's no difference. And so there's been serious studies, though, on this, and they found that knuckle cracking does not cause arthritis. I thought that we might celebrate this good news together. So what I'd like to do is, on the count of three, I'd like for us to crack our knuckles. Now, look, this can be hard for some of you because you've bought into it. Like, you still think your mom is right. You don't care what the research says, or you're just kind of a legalistic person. And even if the rules don't make sense, you're going to follow them. And I want to set us free from all of that. Let's just be set free. So here's what I'd like to do. On the count of three, we're all going to pop our knuckle. Hey, we're all in on this. Okay, some of you are looking at me like it's not going to happen. You're not too good for the rest of us. So on the count of three, we're all going to crack our knuckles. You ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that sound never gets old. Feels good, doesn't it? Just go crazy. I did read some legitimate research on this that said that the primary negative impact on cracking your knuckles is annoying those nearby. So you're welcome. Lie number 3, my mom told me, is don't swallow your gum because it takes how many years to digest? 7 years. It takes 7 years to pass through your digestive system. I remember as a kid really working at not swallowing my gum, but it happened a lot, and I lived with this weight, with this fear that gum was just piling up in my stomach, right? Because it was so hard not to swallow. It reaches a point where it just wants to be swallowed, and how can it be wrong when it feels so right? And so your mom would tell this to you, my mom told it to me, and there's been, shockingly enough, research done on this as well, colonoscopy research, to find out how long it takes for gum to pass, and it turns out you're fine. So next time you're chewing gum, you don't have anything to do with it. You just, embrace your inner rebel and just swallow that thing. And so there are certain things, my point is, there are certain things we've just accepted. There are certain things we just go along with. And we kind of live our lives according to these things. We pass them on to our children. And we find that these things are reinforced by the people around us. Like, as you saw, we're all kind of told some of the same things, and so it must be true. And we end up spending our lives, pouring hydrogen peroxide on our wounds and abstaining from the pleasures of knuckle cracking for no reason. But what if? What if we just accepted some things that have much more significant implications? What if we have just gone along with some things, we've just believed some things, because we've been told them, and it's been reinforced by the culture around us, that have much more dire ramifications. If you study the ministry of Jesus, here's what you'll find, is that he spent a significant amount of his time teaching as a rabbi. He spent a significant amount of his time debunking the myths that the people had been taught about God and about faith. A lot of what he did was to say, you've heard it said this, but I'm going to tell you something different. I know you've been taught to look at it this way. I'm going to give you a new way to look at it. And so he came on the scene and he confronted some false beliefs about faith, about religion, about God that many people had just kind of accepted. So what we'll see in the series is that many of the spiritual leaders of Jesus' day made the focus the outside. That's what it meant to follow God, is that you kind of have your act together and that you keep up your appearances and you follow all the right rules and you keep the rituals. And Jesus came along and he says, look, I know you've been taught that it's what's on the outside. That's not what it's about. It's what's on the inside, and then what's on the inside comes out. It's an inside-out way of following God. But for many of us, that's not how we understood it, and so we learned to kind of keep track of how we were doing on the outside. We learned to keep up appearances, to make sure everybody knew we had a smile on our face and everything was good and we didn't have any problems. And God says, look, man may look on the outside, but I look at the heart. So the people were made to believe some things that weren't true about Jesus, and Jesus is going to address some of these commonly held myths that instead of looking like you have it all together, he wants authentic worship. And instead of carefully observing all these religious rituals, he wants an intimate relationship. That instead of acting more righteous than you really are, what he wants is brokenness. Brokenness is a word that we don't use much these days. It is not something we aspire to. You don't want to write broken on your resume. Brokenness doesn't work very well in the boardroom. We live in a culture that's been termed, maybe you've heard this before, it's been termed a throwaway culture. That more so than any people who've ever lived, when things break, we throw them away. We don't value repairing and fixing, making things new, and we live in a throwaway culture. We throw things away. And so Jesus gives us kind of this different lens to look at broken things. And here's going to be the invitation for us as a church. Jesus is going to say, come here. I want you to look at the world through my eyes. Just step in here and just look at this person through the lens I'm looking at them through, because when Jesus looks at broken, he sees beautiful. He sees something that is valuable. William McDonald, in his book, Lord, Break Me, he begins it this way. He says, usually when something is broken, its value declines. Right, that makes sense. It disappears altogether. So broken dishes and broken bottles and broken mirrors are generally scrapped. They're thrown out. Even a crack in the furniture or a tear in the cloth greatly reduces its resale value. But then he goes on to say, but this isn't the way things work in the spiritual realm. In the world we know, if something breaks, the value goes down. But God puts a premium on broken things, especially broken people. When God sees broken, he sees beautiful, and we're going to see an example of that in Luke 7. I'm going to kind of just share this story with you rather than read it from the text. I'd love to challenge you to read it on your own when you go home. But Jesus has, in this story, he's been invited over to the house of Simon, who is a Pharisee, a religious leader. As a religious leader, it was Simon's duty to invite the visiting rabbi, Jesus, over to his home to eat. And so Jesus gets to this guy's house, and Simon, his heart's not in it. He's not really wanting Jesus there. So Jesus comes in the house, and Simon doesn't give him a greeting. We would say shake his hand. In those days, it would have been a kiss on the cheek or at least a kiss on the hand, but there's nothing like that. And when it's time to eat, Simon doesn't make sure the feet of Jesus were washed, which was just kind of a minimal thing you would do if you had a guest to your house. At least you would give them water to wash their own feet, but that doesn't happen. If you were wanting to especially honor a guest, you might give them some olive oil for anointing their head with oil. It's an inexpensive gesture, but it was a hospitable one. And Simon does none of these things. He didn't do any of them. Jesus comes in, he sits down, and Simon doesn't honor him. But then this woman comes on the scene in verse 37, and things start to get a little bit awkward because she is, verse 37 says, a sinner. Meaning that she is a prostitute. She's a known prostitute in this community. She comes onto this scene, and people start to get a little uncomfortable. I mean, why was she there? Well, she must have heard something that Jesus taught about maybe that day or the day prior that made her know that as broken as she was, she could still be made whole. That God could somehow still do something beautiful with the pieces. And so in her brokenness, she shows up at this dinner party. Now get this, she would never have been invited to this party in 1,000 years. This was not a safe place for her. She would have avoided places like this at all costs, but she had to see Jesus again. And she knew how people would look at her as broken beyond repair. The Pharisee would see someone who was a throwaway, but she knows that's not how Jesus sees her. And so she's going to do something here that many of us would say is impulsive, it's embarrassing, it's inappropriate, it's unacceptable. So Jesus is reclining at the table. This woman approaches and she stands at the filthy feet of Jesus. Everybody's quiet. She feels the stares of condemnation. Other people have their eyes down. They're just embarrassed by her presence, not Jesus. She looks at Jesus and he seems to know what's happened in her heart. He lets her know some way that she's welcome. Maybe it's a warm smile. But he's delighted that she's come. She is undone by this. And the tears just begin to flow. Just a few at first and then more, and she falls on the ground and she begins to kiss his feet. And then she notices something. As the tears from her eyes land on his feet, there are these muddy streaks, and it strikes her. His feet weren't washed. His feet are unwashed. Funny thing about tears is oftentimes it's only when they fill our eyes that we can finally see some things clearly. And she knows what she needs to do. She doesn't have a towel, and she can't ask for one. So she lets down her hair. Now, for a woman in that culture, this was an especially intimate gesture. In fact, you weren't to do this in public. It was between a wife and her husband. She lets down her hair, and she begins to wash the feet of Jesus with her tears and dry them with her hair. She has this bottle of perfume around her neck. She most likely used this in her profession, one drop at a time, many times with many men. But she doesn't put a drop on the feet of Jesus. She just dumps the whole thing out. She just pours it out. Her whole life, she just empties it out. She is broken. Her whole life is poured out. And it was inappropriate. It was reckless. It was impulsive. Jesus says, it's beautiful. He sees the broken as beautiful. And so in the story, here's what Jesus does, is he just turns everything upside down and inside out. He condemns, or he rather rebukes Simon the Pharisee. So you've got this religious leader who has his whole act together. He follows all the rules. He does everything he's supposed to, and Jesus rebukes him. And he turns around and he commends this prostitute who was a broken mess. Everything, he just turns it upside down. And he ends the story by just giving this lady incredible value and purpose. He says in verse 48 to her, your sins are forgiven. And then in verse 50, Jesus says, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And she is made whole. Here's the good news. And maybe you already know this, but in case you don't, I thought it would be important to be super clear. We're all broken. We are all broken. And those of you who don't think you are the most broken. We see that in this story, right? Because the Pharisee, he's sitting there thinking, oh, she's the one who should be embarrassed. No, he should be embarrassed. Who's the one who gets rebuked for brokenness, for just being broke? It's Simon. Simon's broke. He's not broken. He doesn't acknowledge that he's broke, but he is. Here's how broke this guy is. He spent his whole life studying the scriptures. By the time he was 12, he knew the first 5 books of the Bible. The 300 plus prophecies about the Messiah, about Jesus in the Old Testament, he knew them by heart. And Jesus, the Messiah, this person he's studied his whole life, now sits at his table with a cheek that hasn't been kissed and feet that haven't been washed and a head that hasn't been anointed with oil. That's how broke he is. He's so broke he doesn't even know he's broke. That is the thing about brokenness. The less you see it in yourself, the more you need it. And so the point of the sermon really isn't to be broke. You're already broke. The point of the sermon is brokenness, where we stop trying to hide it. Stop trying to pretend like all the pieces fit together. Instead, we say, God, this is it. These are the broken pieces. There's a TED Talk by a lady named Brene Brown. She's a sociologist, and this TED Talk has had about 15 million plus hits as of this last week. It's called The Power of Vulnerability. And in this talk, she just talks about how we all long, we all need to be at a place and with people with whom we can be vulnerable, but most of us don't have that. We don't know those kinds of relationships. We long, in other words, to admit that we're broken. Down deep, we all know we're broke. We long to live with a sense of brokenness, of vulnerability, of authenticity, but it just doesn't feel safe. And so here's what she says in her talk. She says, we are those people. We are those people. That's the truth. She says, most of us are one paycheck, one divorce, one drug-addicted kid, one mental health diagnosis, one serious illness, one sexual assault, one drinking binge, one night of unprotected sex, or one affair from being those people. The ones we don't trust, the ones that we pity, the ones we don't let our children play with, the ones bad things happen to, the ones we don't want living next door. We are those people. You are them. Look around. Everyone in here is broken. There's not one person in this room who is put together. I don't know how impressive they look on the outside, but I'm telling you, we're all broken. We are those people. We are the people who ignore the hurts of others as long as our needs are taken care of. And we are those people who yell at each other in the car on the way to church, and then we get out and pretend like everything's okay. Smile, kids. We are those people. We are the people who think God is somehow more impressed because we've come up with a whole list of our own rules that aren't even mentioned in the Bible. And we follow those, and we hold people accountable to those. We are those people. We are the people who go into deep debt to keep up appearances. We are the people who look down on others because they're different from us in some way. We are the people who work 50-plus hours a week trying to prove our worth. We are the people who take the easy way out and log on to the porn site. We are the people who have holes punched in our closet doors. That's us. We are the people who spend hours on social media trying to convince people our lives are somehow better than they really are. We are those people. We are broken. We're all broken. You want to know how broken we are? Here's how broken we are. Not long ago, we had some folks come to our church from out of country. Not out of city, not out of state, out of country. They're visiting our church, and some members of our church come in and say to them, "You're sitting in our seats." Yeah, that's how broken we are. I think it's ironic that in every service, you're not alone. We all gasp at that. You know what's in your own heart, right? Like, you think that's that bad? We're all a lot worse than that, y'all. We are all broken. There's no one in here who's more deserving or more worthy of God's love and God's grace than anyone else. And so what do we do with it? We try to hide it. It's what you do with brokenness. You ask a kid who breaks something, they know what to do with it. You hide it, and you hope no one finds out about it. And that's what we do. We try to hide it. And as a result, we are the most medicated, the most in debt, the most addicted people in human history. It's what happens when you try to hide your brokenness. It doesn't work. And so we're all broken. What we need is brokenness, where we recognize the reality of our broken condition, understanding that there is no wholeness except through the door marked brokenness. And so that's the bad news, but the good news is the gospel. The good news is Jesus came to make things whole. The good news is that God makes the broken whole through Jesus Christ. About 2 years ago, my oldest daughter, Kinsey, she saved up her money, and she bought a horse that she was going to break, and she was going to train and then sell. So she bought this 1-year-old horse, and she was going to sell it. The idea is for her to sell it when she turns 16 and use the money to go towards a car. And I don't know anything about this stuff, as you might guess, but my wife grew up doing these things. And so I agreed to it, even though I technically wasn't consulted. And so she gets this 1-year-old horse, and the horse comes home, and it's out in the field, it bucks and it kicks, bites, and I thought this is not going to work. But then she starts working with the horse. She spends hours and hours in a round pen, with a stern voice and a whip. She doesn't call it a whip. I forget what it's called, but it looks like a whip to me. I think the horse would say it's a whip. But she spends hours in this pen with a stern voice and a whip, and she eventually breaks the horse. Finally, the moment of truth comes where she gets on the horse to ride it. It's never been ridden. But that's the purpose, right? I mean, that's why she has it. It's to train it, to ride it, to give it a purpose. And so she gets on the horse to ride it, and she rides around on the horse. And then this last Thursday, I was watching her, and I saw her hop on the horse without a saddle. There's no saddle. She just got on this horse bareback, and she ran it through a field. And then there was joy. It's fulfilling its purpose. I think I've got the picture of the two of them here. So, you want to take bets on whether or not this horse is going to get sold for a car? I don't think it's going to work. I think this horse is stuck with us for a long time. We'll see. But here's what I want you to catch, right? So as much as my daughter loves her horse, God loves you a million times more. But the only way that we really fulfill our purpose, the only way for God's beauty, God's power to be on display is through brokenness. It's where God does his best work. And so Jeremiah talks about this, Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. The prophet Jeremiah writes, it says, "This is the word that came to me, to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down at once to the potter's house, and there I will reveal my words to you." So Jeremiah says, I went down to the potter's house, and there he was working away at the wheel, but the jar that he was making from the clay, it became flawed in the potter's hands. And so he made it into another jar, as seemed right for him to do. And the word of the Lord came to me. God said to Jeremiah, "House of Israel, can I not treat you as this potter treats his clay?" Look, I know that your jar hasn't turned out how you thought it would turn out. I know that you had in mind what the jar would look like, what life would look like. It hasn't happened. At some point along the way, it's gotten broke. So you can hide the pieces and you can keep pretending like everything's okay, or you can say to the potter, "Will you make this into another jar? One that seems right to you?" God says, that's what I want for my people. I know the jar is broken. I know it hasn't turned out how you wanted it to turn out. Let me see what I can do with this. I was reading some research it's about this ceramic restoration process. It's called, I'm going to mess this up, but it's called kintsugi. It originated in Japan in the 1500s, and kintsugi is an art in which broken ceramic pieces are sealed together, and instead of hiding the cracks from when it was broken, the cracks are highlighted, and then they are traced over with gold. So here's some examples. So you have a valuable ceramic piece that is somehow broken. But instead of throwing it away, you take the ceramic piece and you put the pieces back together. But instead of trying to hide the cracks, they accentuate the cracks with gold. Here's what happens. The value goes up. They are worth more. In fact, I think we have another picture of this. In fact, there has been collectors who've been accused of purposely taking a valuable piece like this and breaking it so that it can be put back together with gold and be even more valuable than it was before. And this is what God does for us. That we are all broken people. We all have cracks and we try to hide them. It's our instinct, I get it. But God says, you know what? Those very things that you're most overwhelmed by, you're most afraid of, the very things you most want to keep a secret, the very things you most want to be done with, the very thing you wish was not true about you. If you let me, it can be an opportunity to turn it into something beautiful, more valuable than before.